Welcome back to my channel. In this video, we're going to cover authorization to test along with acceptable identification. Authorization to test. After the nursing board declares you eligible, you will receive an authorization to test email. You will receive your authorization to test email via the email address you provided when registering. You must have your authorization to test email to schedule an appointment to take the Nclex exam. To gain access to the Nclex exam, you will be required to present one form of acceptable identification. The first and last name on your identification must match exactly the name you provided when registering. Authorization to test validity dates. Each authorization to test is valid for a period of time specified by the board. The average length of the authorization to test is 90 days. Once the board has declared you eligible to test and you receive your authorization to test, you must test within the 90 days of the authorization to test. Call Nclex Candidate Services if you have lost your authorization to test or if your board has made you eligible and you have not received your authorization to test email. Your authorization to test contains the authorization number, candidate identification number, and an expiry date. Please note, this validity date of 90 days cannot be extended for any reason. So guys, kindly take note of these 3 days or of these 90 days or 3 months and make your plans to sit for the exams around this time because it will not be extended. Let's have a look at what is acceptable identification. Acceptable identification. Name. The first and last names printed on your identification must match exactly the first and last names found on your authorization to test email. If the name with which you registered is different from the name on your identification, you must bring legal name change documentation to the test center on the day of the test. The only acceptable forms of legal name change documentation are the following: a marriage license or divorce decree or a court action legal name change documents. All documents must contain the name change in Roman characters and be the original copies. Candidates wishing to make a legal name change, address change, or email address change must contact their nursing board. This cannot be done at the test center. If the name on your identification and your acceptance to test email do not match, you will be turned away and will have to re-register and pay another exam fee. Identification requirements. When you arrive at the test center, you will be required to present one form of acceptable identification. If you arrive at the test center without acceptable identification, you will be turned away and required to re-register and pay another exam fee. If you paid the additional international scheduling fee, that will be forfeited as well. As previously discussed, no fee is refundable. All forms of identification must be valid and meet the following requirements. If the identification does not meet these requirements, you will be turned away and required to re-register and pay another examination fee. So the first identification requirement that you must meet is physical or non-digital. Second, non-expired. It has to be a valid identification. You have to present the actual identification. If it's your marriage certificate, it should be original and in your hands. If it's your passport, you should carry it with you and take it with you to the exam center. It should also be government issued, and it should include your name in Roman characters. First and last names printed on the presented identification must match exactly the first and last names found on your authorization to test email. Include a recent photograph. It must also include your signature. If the identification presented does not contain a signature but meets all other ID requirements, a secondary form of identification is required. The signature on the secondary identification must match exactly with the first and last name on the primary identification and with the names that you provided when you registered. The secondary identification must contain a signature in Roman characters. Examples of acceptable forms of identification for domestic test centers are passport books and cards, driver's license, provisional or territorial or state identification card, permanent residence card, and military identification card. The only identification acceptable for international test centers including Puerto Rico are passport books and cards. If your ID does not contain a signature but meets all other identification requirements listed above, you must bring in a secondary form of identification to the test center. The signature on your secondary identification must match exactly with the first and last name in your primary ID and with the names that you provided when you registered. Your secondary identification must contain a signature in Roman characters. So guys, we've come to the end of this video, but my takeaway from this is you obviously have your primary identification, for example, your passport. Your names must match what you have on your authorization to test email. When you first registered, the names you provided must match what's in your passport. However, I would recommend carrying more than one form of identification. So you can bring in your passport, bring in your driver's license, bring in your marriage certificate, bring in your divorce, anything that you feel has your full names or identifies you as, as a government issued document. Bring them in to the test center. You never know. Sometimes you make a mistake thinking you've provided the correct information without realizing. So bring all these multiple identification documents. And when you get to the test center, if everything is fine, that's well and good. If it's not, at least you've got backup identification documents. We've come to the end of this video. Kindly consider subscribing. I will catch you in the next one.